Hi, welcome to whatever this is. One day I was sitting around, probably eating cookies or something, and I started thinking way too hard about animal sidekicks in Disney movies. As one does. I was mostly pondering why they existed, if they served greater purposes beyond comic relief, how well certain movies utilized them over others, and through all that pondering, this video was born. I want to take a look at every Disney princess movie and analyze their use of animal sidekicks. Hopefully, by the end of this, you and I will have fostered a better understanding and appreciation for these characters and their purposes outside of comic relief. For the record, I know that the animal sidekick trope isn't exclusive to the princess movies. I'm just keeping this analysis focused on those movies for the sake of time, and also because this trope is very heavily associated with those movies. We can thank Maui for that one.
No.
If you wear a dress and you have an animal sidekick, you're a princess.
Don't worry though, I'm still going to include Frozen and a couple of the newer movies, even though they aren't technically part of the Disney Princess brand yet. Alright, let's not waste any more time and jump into Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So this movie immediately establishes one of the biggest patterns we're going to see with the whole animal sidekick situation. Often a Disney princess will be seen talking to or getting along with the local wildlife just for the sake of really exaggerating how kind and pure of heart these princesses are. This is especially prevalent in the early princess movies, but can still persist in later entries, usually on much smaller scales. In this film, the forest animals come to comfort Snow White after her traumatic experience in the woods, and she quickly befriends all of them. Unlike later movies, the animals here aren't well defined by any particular character, they're just kind of an ensemble of cute creatures for Snow White to talk to before the dwarves show up. They do participate in the plot, but not so much that you couldn't theoretically cut them from the movie entirely. You very well could have just had the dwarves be the ones to find Snow White in the woods and bring her to the cottage, and you didn't need the animals to force the dwarves to go attack the evil queen at the end. It's nice that these guys aren't just completely forgotten about and aren't given things to do, but their presence in this movie is really overshadowed by everything else going on. I wouldn't really say they're a bad inclusion though. They don't take up an egregious amount of screen time, and they serve their function of showcasing Snow White's purity pretty well. They're somewhat needless, but perfectly harmless. Alright, so that one was pretty quick and easy, right? Well, it would be wrong to not stop down and talk about the dwarves themselves for a moment, since they do carry with them a lot of tropes associated with animal sidekicks, most notably their use as comic relief characters. We should probably take this opportunity to properly define what does and doesn't make a character an animal sidekick. First of all, they don't actually have to be animals, that's just kind of the shorthand word, thanks again to Maui over here. Any sort of anthropomorphized thing will do the trick. Additionally, I tend to define these characters as ones that aren't necessary to the story being told. Essentially, they are clearly distinct from the main characters or main villains and can theoretically be cut or replaced. Now, that sounds really harsh and limiting, but I think we'll come to find throughout this analysis that restriction is a lot more loose than you might think. Just for an example from a non-princess movie, so I don't spoil my own analysis, the movie Hercules includes the characters of Pegasus and Phil, both of which are animals, sort of, and also not really main characters. I'd consider Pegasus to be an animal sidekick because his role in the story is pretty superfluous and has no incredibly significant impact on our hero's journey or arc, despite the fact that without Pegasus, a lot of the action set pieces would probably be wildly different. I would not consider Phil to be an animal sidekick because he is pretty essential to the story. You can't really cut the character who trains Hercules without changing a lot of the basics about how the story plays out from there, and changing a lot of the key emotional turns towards the end of the movie. Hopefully that explains the distinction I'm trying to convey here. Alright, so back to the dwarves. Are they animal sidekicks based on the definition I just haphazardly established? Maybe? They certainly aren't main characters and have very little to do with Snow White's main character arc. But at the same time, they are so ever-present in this movie and honestly treated like the main characters for so much of it that it's kind of hard to comfortably relegate them to the animal sidekick categorization. Like, the plot doesn't change if you remove these guys, but the heart and soul of the movie does, even if that heart and soul has very little to do with our main character. Okay, I need to move on already. So Cinderella is responsible for a lot of firsts in terms of animal sidekicks. If we exclude the dwarves, these are our first named animal sidekicks, most notably Jacques and Gus Gus, and our first animal sidekick musical number. Sort of. Again, you need to exclude the dwarves, and also Whistle While You Work, which doesn't have any of the forest animals singing, but does feature them prominently. I don't know, whatever, it doesn't matter all that much. While Jacques and Gus Gus are part of that greater Princess is Nice to All the Animals ensemble, there's a very clear focus placed on them as the predominant animal sidekick characters in this movie, so we'll focus on them. First of all, I think using the animals to convey how kind our princess is works much better here than it did in Snow White. It gives us a window into Cinderella's personality while still keeping her isolated, which is important for this story. We don't feel as bad for her if she's chatting it up with a bunch of human best friends. Having her only friends being the mice in her walls and birds that hang out by her window really ups the sympathy points while still giving us cute comic relief characters to work with. Additionally, this is a very clear example of a common use for these animal sidekick characters, giving our main character someone to talk to. Pretty sure this is the single most common use for these characters, giving the audience insight into how our main character is feeling without just having them talk to themselves the whole movie. Again, the plot and character arc doesn't change, but how the audience understands the plot and characters does, making them a worthwhile inclusion. And bonus points, these guys do actually influence the plot a bit. Making the dress and getting the key to Cinderella at the end go a long way in making these characters feel less useless, even if these plot roles could have very easily been written out. So yeah, sounds like Jaq and Gus Gus hit it out of the park. The gold standard for animal sidekicks. But I've been ignoring the elephant in the room here. There is too much of these guys in this movie. This might be the worst trap these animal sidekicks could fall into, effectively taking over the movie despite not being all that important to the story. Mind you, I really enjoy this movie, but I cannot deny how needless and drawn out these mice slapstick segments are. They really do take away from the grander narrative. What we can learn from Jaq and Gus Gus is that there needs to be a certain balance with these animal sidekick characters. By their very nature, they are not the focus of the story. You don't want to create a character and have them go underutilized. If you do that, they'd be completely forgettable and pointless, but they can't overstay their welcome or the movie will suffer. In that sense, it's probably better they go underutilized than overutilized. I really like Jaq and Gus Gus. They are charming characters and I grew attached to them over the course of watching this film, but I find myself knowing more about them than Prince Charming, the Tremaines, or even Cinderella herself. Some final notes before we move on. Gus Gus is our first sort of sidekick of a sidekick since he's clearly second in command to Jaq. He seems to exist to give Jaq someone to play off of when Cinderella isn't around. Finally, Jaq, despite clearly being an intelligent character, talks in this borderline incomprehensible way. We're gonna see this quite a bit, animal sidekicks being unable to talk at all or having some sort of cutesy baby talk way of communicating, done to make the character more endearing to the audience. So this is going to be a quick one. Aurora's animal companions are the same Snow White flavor of let's just have them be friends with all the wild animals because they're so nice. Except it's so much worse here because they basically only exist for one scene and never show up again. It's like they had a Disney princess checklist, realized they hadn't written in random animal ensemble, and rushed it in last minute. Maybe they were overcorrecting after the backlash from Cinderella overusing the mice. I don't know. If you want to argue the true animal sidekicks of this movie are the three good fairies, I'm gonna have to disagree with you pretty hard there. These three are kind of the backbone of the entire story and honestly act more like main characters than Aurora does. It's not her fault, the story demands she be asleep for half the movie. So yeah, despite having a lot of comic relief moments, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather don't quite fit the animal sidekick mold. I guess since we don't have much else to talk about here, I'll briefly address the villain animal sidekick since Maleficent's goons and her crow Diablo get some decent screen time in this movie. Functionally, they are pretty similar to the protagonist's animal sidekicks, but I don't think I'm going to be addressing them in this analysis simply because it would take a lot more time, and these guys pretty effectively create their own category of trope Disney character. Maybe in a sequel video, I don't know. If you want a more concrete reason to differentiate them, pretty much every animal sidekick doubles as a comic relief character, and this isn't always true for villain animal sidekicks. Diablo is actually a perfect example of this, but if you want a more substantial example, Flotsam and Jetsam, there you go. Actually, that's a perfect transition into... The Little Mermaid is probably the best use of animal sidekicks we've seen yet, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go over our trio of animal companions, Sebastian, Flounder, and Scuttle. All of these characters are great because the roles they serve in the story are distinct from one another. Flounder is Ariel's confidant, the character for Ariel to talk to so the audience can gain a better understanding of her. Scuttle is pretty blatantly the primary comic relief character, and Sebastian brings something new to the table. He's what I'm going to call a bridge character, a smaller character that acts as the bridge between two bigger characters. In this case, Sebastian is the bridge that connects Ariel and her father King Triton throughout the story. Sebastian is the voice of Triton in Ariel's head without the actual gravitas of Triton being there. Whenever Triton needs to be brought back into the narrative, Sebastian is the one who goes and gets him. It's an incredibly interesting role by Disney animal sidekick standards. It's a perfectly removable role like that of the other animal sidekicks, you can just have Triton be around when he needs to be instead of going through Sebastian, but the character's presence enhances the narrative by reminding us and Ariel of Triton and the emotional stakes that come with that in an organic and non-intrusive way. In this way, we can also credit Sebastian as probably being the most plot-relevant character of the bunch. Now, what's great about the Little Mermaid trio is how despite them having these clearly distinct roles, they're totally capable of sharing those roles with each other. This is the long way of saying Sebastian and Flounder can be funny, Flounder and Scuttle can be plot-relevant, and Sebastian and Scuttle can be Ariel's shoulder to cry on. The roles of these characters are malleable and it keeps things interesting. Additionally, having three animal sidekicks to bounce between helps keep the focus on our main character, believe it or not. Since we're not spending so much time with just one of these guys, our focus always comes back to Ariel. She's the constant thread as we see her bounce between the colorful cast. Finally, these characters are incredibly important to the second half of this movie because Ariel loses her voice. At this point in the narrative, we are forced to rely on the dialogue between Sebastian, Flounder, and Scuttle as our limited viewpoint into what's going on in the story while Ariel can't speak. I imagine that's why there are three of these guys, is to keep the dynamics fresh and interesting throughout that second act stretch where they have most of the dialogue. So yeah, high marks all around. I really have no complaints with this set of animal sidekicks, and I haven't even mentioned Under the Sea, that's a bop. So again, let me remind you, animal sidekicks don't literally have to be animals. That naming convention is completely arbitrary, and Beauty and the Beast is a perfect showcase of why. The animal sidekicks of this movie are very obviously the enchanted objects of Beast's castle, most notably Lumiere, Cogsworth, Mrs. Potts, and Chip. You can throw in Fifi in the wardrobe too if you want. I don't care. So we essentially have another trio here since Chip doesn't really get much to do. So are Lumiere, Cogsworth, and Mrs. Potts just as effective as the Little Mermaid trio? Not really. All of these guys pretty much serve the same role. They're bridge characters between Belle and the Beast, with the arguments between Lumiere and Cogsworth serving as most of the comic relief. This works well in the first half of the story since Belle and the Beast are so at odds that they kinda need these bridge characters in order for anything to happen. But once Beast saves Belle's life at around the midpoint, they don't really need those bridge characters anymore since they can just interact on their own. Because of that, their presence in the second half of the movie feels kinda pointless. I guess you can also argue that they all act as the confidant character for Beast, giving us a viewpoint into what his character is really like early on in the story. But again, that role becomes meaningless towards the second half. This wouldn't be that big of an issue if they weren't still, doing stuff in the second half. There's this whole big sequence of them defending the castle when the reality is none of that matters at this point in the story. The drama between Beast, Belle, and Gaston should be the focus. But yeah, let's watch Lumiere light this guy's pants on fire. I'm being a little harsh here, don't get me wrong. I love Beauty and the Beast and I love these characters. I'm just trying to be objective as to how well these characters were used. In any case, their continued presence is nowhere near as egregious as the mice in Cinderella. I guess I should also briefly mention Philippe, Belle's horse. I guess you can call him an animal sidekick if you want, but let me pitch to you a new category of Disney trope character called Disney horses. These characters are horses that have little to no character traits and are just there to be horses for characters to ride on. They are often confused for animal sidekicks because they are animals, but frankly they aren't even worth that status with how little they actually do. Well, would you look at that, another trio. Here we've got Abu, Raja, and the magic carpet. No, Genie is not an animal sidekick, he is essential to the plot and the emotional core of the movie. Abu and Raja are the easiest to explain. They are clearly the confidant characters for Aladdin and Jasmine respectively. Raja might as well not exist after the first act of the movie, and that's fine since he's pretty much just relegated to the backgrounds of scenes. Abu is a lot more ever-present with some minor participation in the plot, things like swiping the lamp from Jafar. But unlike the Beauty and the Beast characters, he's never overly focused on staying comfortably within his pay grade. That just leaves the carpet, which I think introduces an entirely new category of animal sidekick. Let's call these the cool sidekicks, since most other sidekicks fit pretty comfortably into cute and funny. The cool sidekicks, while still having clearly defined character traits, are often mute and primarily utilized in the story for cool sequences, action-oriented or otherwise. The reason they're usually mute seems to be as an excuse to not spend too much extra time on them with lengthy dialogue scenes. The idea here is quickly establish the characters using pantomime so the audience likes them, and then let them do cool stuff. Carpet here is the prime example of a cool animal sidekick, pretty much only existing for the Cave of Wonders escape sequence and the absolutely breathtaking A Whole New World. And I'm cool with that because, yeah, those scenes are amazing. The strength of the Aladdin trio is how non-intrusive they are. They serve their roles perfectly and aren't focused on it all outside of that. Perfectly functional and memorable, it all works pretty well. Also, worth mentioning that Abu is another example of this sort of non-speech, kind of what I was getting at with Jock. Monkey sounds that occasionally form words but no actual talking. Makes him more endearing. It makes for an interesting comparison point to the Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast sidekicks since they were able to talk without any issues. I wonder if that had any effect on how endearing they were. I'd say probably not since I like all of these characters a lot, but that's pretty subjective, so I'll leave that for you to decide. Okay, so this movie's kind of really bad, and that is even prevalent in the animal sidekick situation, so let's just get through this quickly. Our animal sidekicks here are Miko and Flit. I guess you could argue for Grandmother Willow as well, but the lack of comic relief associated with the character, as well as her general vibe of a mentor figure, makes me think otherwise. So focusing on Miko and Flit, these two are super forgettable. They kind of act as confidant characters for Pocahontas, but where other confidant characters were also fun and memorable, Pocahontas might as well be talking to a brick wall here. I remember nothing about Miko except that the villain animal psychic of this movie totally hates him, and I know even less about Flit. And this has nothing to do with them not talking. You can totally make animal sidekicks memorable without them talking. There have been several examples of that in this video. They just did a bad job with these guys and with this movie as a whole. So this one's interesting. Here we have Mushu and Cricky. I'm not really going to talk about Cricky all that much, kind of like Gus Gus, he's just the sidekick of a sidekick, someone for Mushu to play off of when Mulan isn't around. Additionally, I'm not going to talk about Mulan's army friends. They're a bit too oppositional throughout most of the movie to be considered animal sidekicks. They're here for comic relief, yes, but they also just kind of represent the army environment Mulan is dealing with. I don't know, if you want to argue they should count, I'd love to see your reasoning. And obviously Mulan has a horse, which I won't include because that's just another Disney horse. So that just leaves us with Mushu, who is effectively taking on the role of animal sidekick completely solo in this movie. The first time we've really seen that in this analysis. Because of that, he ends up with a lot of screen time and fulfills a lot of the roles we have previously talked about all on his own. He's Mulan's primary confidant while she's in the army. He's the main comic relief character. He kind of acts as a bridge between Mulan and her home life. Yeah, that one's a bit of a stretch, but there's something to that. I just can't really put it into words right now. So yeah, his inclusion definitely feels worthwhile, at the very least for that ever-important confidant role. But yeah, Mushu kind of really overstays his welcome. There's just not enough going on here to really warrant his constant presence and abundance of screen time. It's not the worst thing in the world, again, nowhere near as bad as the Cinderella mice, but yeah, there's a reason the Mulan remake, as garbage as it is, opted to cut him entirely. Actually, now that I think about it, the remakes of these movies might be an interesting window to analyze animal sidekicks from, since the vast majority of them seem to cut the animal sidekicks entirely. Should I backpedal a bit and do that? Why not, it'll be quick. Cinderella remake, mice are basically non-existent. Good call. Maleficent. This movie is so wildly different from the original that I'm not even gonna bother. Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin keeps the sidekicks around, doesn't really change all that much since these movies are considerably more beloved, and changing too much probably would have been viewed as heresy. And Mulan cut Mushu but didn't really put anything to fill his void. Because of that, we don't get a very strong viewpoint into what Mulan's thinking and feeling throughout the movie. I don't mind the idea of cutting Mushu, but he did serve a purpose that the remake just completely throws out the window, all in all making it a worse film, among other reasons. The Princess and the Frog is kind of a weird one. We get two main animal sidekicks here with Louis and Ray. They both serve the basic plot function of guiding Tiana and Naveen through the bayou, but otherwise don't fit into any of the big roles we've been discussing throughout this analysis. They act as comic relief, sure, but they don't really act like confidant or bridge characters or cool characters, and the plot relevance in the third act is, well, none. So why exactly are they here? Well, I think having Tiana and Naveen travel with the group helps to realistically transition them from a very argumentative relationship to a more naturally romantic one. You can understand why they'd put petty squabbling aside when they're hanging out with other people, thus giving them the opportunity to understand each other better. Additionally, Ray sort of briefly becomes a bridge character towards the end. While Tiana and Naveen are having trouble conveying their feelings to each other, he's kind of there to tell Tiana what's going on with Naveen to the best of his knowledge. That's kind of the best we've got for these guys. I'm having trouble really defining what else they bring to the table. I mean, Ray dies at the end, which certainly feels like a big milestone for this analysis. None of these characters have just died up to this point, but this death has very little to do with the journeys of our main characters, so it feels kind of meaningless. Both in the context of this analysis and realistically the movie itself, this death kind of just comes out of left field and it doesn't carry much weight in retrospect. Tangled's animal sidekick is much more standard and easy to explain. It's Pascal, Rapunzel's cute, mute animal confidant with some very minor plot relevance. It's as standard as an animal sidekick can get, not much more to say there. But there is something a bit unique happening here with the character of Maximus. Maximus goes from being a secondary antagonist to an additional animal sidekick. We effectively watch this character go through a mini redemption arc in the background of the Flynn and Rapunzel romance, and it's pretty cool. I don't think we've seen a character slowly become an animal sidekick throughout the course of the movie. And by the end, he's a full-on cool sidekick as he and Flynn race for the tower in the climax. Maximus certainly makes for a far more dynamic character than what we might expect from this archetype. I wish I had more to say here, but Pascal keeps things simple, and I've pretty much said everything I could think of for Maximus, so moving on. Braves doesn't have an animal sidekick. At best there's Angus, but that's pretty blatantly just a Disney horse. I guess the triplets exist, but they get so little screen time and spend so little time with Merida that they are effectively just as pointless as the animals from Sleeping Beauty. Frankly, I don't even really know why this is an official Disney princess movie, so let's just move on. Frozen gets two animal sidekicks. First is Sven, who is really just Kristoff's confidant. Second, and much more prominent, is Olaf. Olaf kind of plays confidant to Anna in some of the last scenes of the movie, but otherwise he's pretty much just here for comic relief. He's kind of just a really weird character concept. I guess you could say he's the representation of Anna and Elsa's love for each other, since this is their childhood imaginary friend brought to life. A character idea like that had the potential for a lot of emotional weight, now that I think about it. Does the movie actually deliver on that? I guess a bit here in this some people are worth melting for scene. Like, if there's any moment that really highlights the reason for Olaf's existence is how he's perfectly willing to sacrifice himself for these people he barely knows. There's something there about the power of Anna and Elsa's love in this context, which I guess eventually gets fulfilled by the final act of true love that saves Anna. Maybe Olaf has introduced another new category. Or maybe I've just been ignoring a really important aspect of, well, characters, the emotional weight they carry. It's really easy to just write off these animal sidekicks as nothing more than comic relief characters with blatant objective story functions, but that logic doesn't really work when the main purpose of the characters is to add to the emotional turmoil. Actually, looking back on Beauty and the Beast, Mulan, and Princess and the Frog, that's kind of what all those animal sidekicks have been doing, huh? The whole point of the enchanted objects in the castle is to raise the stakes. It's not just the beast's humanity that's on the line, it's theirs. And part of the reason we care about this relationship is we want to see all these fun, lovable characters get their happy ending. After all, the beast is a jerk for most of the movie. It's gonna be a while before we actually care about him. And in Mulan, Mushu's plight had some admittedly less impactful stakes. If Mulan doesn't succeed, Mushu fails and is doomed to ring the gong his whole life, or worse. In a way, Mulan and Mushu are kindred spirits, longing to break out of the roles their societies have forced upon them. In caring about Mushu's struggle, we care more about Mulan's struggle. And you know what, yeah, maybe it was a really cheap emotional jab that served very little purpose, but Ray's death was brutal. We liked the guy. And at the very least, seeing him join Evangeline in the night sky had a certain amount of thematic relevance in a movie about an unlikely romance. So yeah, I guess it isn't really fair to say that these characters get too much screen time when their individual stories can add to the narrative in some way beyond just propping up the main characters. Olaf especially seems explicitly designed to draw attention to and enhance the thematic resonance of the film. I wouldn't say this makes him leagues better than some of our other standout animal sidekicks, but it's certainly an important angle to consider from here on out. Moana technically has 3 animal sidekicks, but it basically just has 2. Pua might as well not exist, possibly the first ever animal sidekick to be purely created for marketability, seeing as he does literally nothing and is only ever in the movie at the very beginning and end. Then there's Heihei, who is pretty much exclusively here for comic relief. Like, yes, Moana talks to him when no one else is around, but calling Heihei a confidant just feels wrong, since he and Moana aren't really friends at all. Then there's the Ocean, which just gives me big carpet vibes. New character who is really just here to occasionally do something cool. There's more plot significance to this one, sort of a greater spiritual implication to the character's existence, but any potential this character has to carry with a greater story or emotional weight is usurped by the grandmother spirit being introduced to comfort Moana instead. None of these characters overstay their welcome, so to that extent it's hard to complain about them, but yeah, they're kinda weak in my book. Briefly stopping at Frozen 2 just as the rare opportunity to see how our animal sidekicks may have changed with a proper theatrical sequel. Olaf is surprisingly consistent with how he carries with him that extra emotional weight that comes with being representative of the love between the main characters. Now, I don't think the rest of the movie is really good enough to support the weight of Olaf's death scene, but he still gets points. Sven is the same, so we'll just skip over him. Some new ones introduced are Gale, the mute gust of wind who is barely around, so it probably shouldn't even count. Bruni, the little lizard guy who joins Pua in the literally only here for marketability camp, and Elsa's water horse, which fits in comfortably with the Disney horses. So this is technically it for the official Disney Princess movies plus Frozen, but since ending on Frozen 2 is kind of a downer, let's go over the 2 newest releases since they will likely get incorporated into the Disney Princess brand in due time. So our animal sidekick here is Tuk Tuk, pretty standard confidant / cool character. Worth noting that Tuk Tuk doesn't really stick as well as some of these other animal sidekicks, probably because Raya and the Last Dragon's cast is so large that Tuk Tuk gets lost in the shuffle. Because of that, we'll keep this segment short and talk about the movie I actually want to talk about. At first glance, Encanto doesn't have much in the way of animal sidekicks. The closest thing is Pico, the toucan who briefly joins Mirabel in her climb up Bruno's tower, but that role is so minor that it seems like a bit of a stretch. Ironically, there's actually a character in this movie that can talk to animals, Antonio, much in the same way the Disney princesses of old were able to do. This was possibly done to exaggerate how different Mirabel is from other Disney princesses, which can be seen with her sisters as well. Luisa's strong, like Mulan or Merida. Mirabel isn't. Isabel is perfect and beautiful, like, well, basically all the princesses, but Mirabel wears glasses and is generally dorkier. Heck, even her mom, Julieta, has healing powers like Rapunzel. This sort of meta juxtaposition, I think, serves to further isolate Mirabel in the mind of the audience, exaggerating her position as the not-special Madrigal, thus making her journey to prove that wrong all the more satisfying. Okay, this is starting to go past the scope of this video, so let's talk about what I'd consider to be the true animal sidekick of this movie, Casita. Casita comfortably falls into the mute and cool character camp, giving me big carpet and ocean vibes. But despite that, Casita also acts as Mirabel's main confidant, which is interesting since we haven't seen that from one of these characters before. On top of that, Casita is the main setting for the entire movie, so even without all that other stuff, the audience is bound to form a strong emotional connection with the character. This all culminates in the destruction of Casita. All the stakes of this movie surround literal cracks forming on Casita, and seeing our cast of characters fail completely and effectively kill this character is really heartbreaking in the perfect way, especially with Casita representing the perfection of the Madrigals. In that sense, Casita is an incredibly plot-relevant character, but I'm still comfortable calling it a sidekick because the reality is they didn't need to give the Madrigal house its own personality. The plot wouldn't change at all if it was just a building, but making it its own character heightens the emotional resonance of this film so dramatically, to a degree I don't think we've seen in this analysis up until now. All with a character that is surprisingly non-intrusive. There are pretty sizable chunks of this movie where Casita just isn't doing anything. So, she's not distracting from anything else going on. But at the same time, you never forget about Casita because, well, it's where you are for the entire movie, because it's the house. So what Yeah, at least right now, I'm pretty comfortable calling Casita my favorite Disney animal sidekick, at least among the princess movies. So, what's the takeaway from all this? Well, there are clearly good ways and bad ways to do animal sidekicks. More often than not, they are simply there for our lead to have someone to talk to, and if the screen time they're given reflects that limited role, then I think it's fair to consider those effective uses of animal sidekick characters. But it's obvious that if the story allows, these characters can bring a lot more to the table than what might be initially assumed, and often serve to greatly enhance the stories they're a part of when done well. So, yeah, a little more than just comic relief, wouldn't you say? Hey, welcome back to the weird Jiminy loop outro land. Funny story, I actually recorded this video about a year ago and have just been procrastinating editing it together ever since then. So, if you thought that ending was really abrupt, yeah, I kind of thought so too, but I didn't want to insert a new recording and mess with the flow of the original one. Anyway, the main reason I decided to push to get this video done now is because holy shit, why did my last big video get so many views and almost 500 subscribers? Like, thank you guys, seriously, this is so absurd and really gives me so much more motivation to keep making stuff. Like, we're basically halfway to monetization. That's nuts. So, if you feel so inclined, please subscribe for whatever's coming down the pipeline. Hopefully in my next video I will finally have slightly better audio quality. Alright, see you later.